going to talk. Just say hi.
Hi there.
All right.
This is the test.
All right. Hearing you perfect. And we're live. The first section is on childhood. What is your full name and why were you named it?
Well, my full name is Arthur Joel Widman, and I had an uncle Arthur, that is my father's brother, and an uncle Joel, my father's brother, and Widman was a great Swedish family name.
Did you have any nicknames as you were growing up?
Yeah, Buddy, or Buddy Boy. It's interesting the dog we have here today is called Buddy.
Hey, why Buddy? Is there a story behind it?
I don't think so, or my parents only knew, or I don't know. It was probably just a common name at the time, and you know how kids get a nickname early on.
Right.
But that was when I was, a real small child.
Do you have any nicknames now as an adult?
Well, when I was in high school or whatnot, a few of my friends in Maine used to call me Pinky.
Pinky.
And I don't know where that came from, except the color of my hair, which was then red. And when I went into business, it was a business that my father was in and my uncle Arthur. So there were two Arthurs, and so I took the name Barry, so that when people called, if they'd say, well, I want to talk to Mr. Widman, and they'd say, well, which Mr. Widman? And they'd say, Arthur Widman. Well, then they'd say, which Mr. Arthur Widman? So I took the name Barry. Simplified life.
All right. What do family members call you now?
I think outside of Pop and Granddad and those kind of things, I guess they call me Art.
Where and when were you born?
Well, actually, I was born in Oradell, New Jersey, on the corner of Kinnicamack Road and Lotus Avenue, which was where Marge lived when we were going together. At Arnold's funeral. No. Arnold's maternity home. I think I had a little twisted. In those days, a lot of women didn't go to the hospital, but the doctors ran maternity homes, which is sort of a clinic kind of a setting, I guess.
And when was that? What was the exact day?
March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, 1930.
What were your chores as a child?
Well, I had a lot of chores. My dad was a great one for calling, "You, bud," and that meant, "Get over here, I've got something I'd like you to do." He worked in the city, commuted, and during the war, that is Second World War, I was 10, 11 when it started, and until 1945, so I was 15, and he had a victory garden. And he was not really much of a gardener, so I was the self-appointed dig up the garden, pull out the weeds, cut the lawn, shovel the snow, and I enjoyed all those things. It really wasn't a lot of work. And one thing we did do, which is unusual, and I still remember so vividly, my dad had a great desire to cut wood. I'm not sure where that came from. We lived in Westwood, and there wasn't any. We had a fireplace, but there was plenty of woods in back of our house in Westwood, same as here, just solid woods for a mile. So you could just walk out and pick up all the wood you wanted. But he and I used to cut logs with a two-man saw. And I can remember in the beginning I wasn't much help. I just kept wobbling the end of the saw, I think, around. But he just somehow loved to do that, loved to see that. And I have that saw, that is, I fished it out of his old barn.
Yeah.
And I still have the two-man saw in my garage.
An heirloom piece.
An heirloom piece, among many.
Now, how is the world now different from when it was like when you were a child?
Well, I guess it was different in technology and a lot of things, but in many ways it was very, very similar. Probably the most noticeable thing was the milkman brought the milk every day in a glass bottle, and the cream was on top of the bottle, and the cream was a treasured thing, which we used to love to drink. You wouldn't get away. Butter was just a delightful thing, spread it on thick, and fat was never an issue. My father and his three of his four brothers all died before 60, and I think since they went with heart attacks, I think that might have been a major cause. Health things, I guess, are different. We didn't have television. We had radio, which we loved to listen to, and I think in many ways was more entertaining than TV. And we didn't have so many choices, so it was, just a delight. As a kid, I used to listen to Tom Mix and the Lone Ranger on radio, and it played in your mind. It was better than, than Cinemax or anything, because you could make it look the way you thought it looked. And we just had great radio programs, although when I think about it, there was probably one a day that I listened to.
What would you consider to be the most important inventions that have been made during your lifetime?
Well, that's hard to tell because so many inventions go back even beyond my lifetime. But the jet plane, of course, the regular propeller plane was around, but jets, I remember, came in 1958. At least that's the first time I flew on them. And that was like the beginning of an era. The satellites that are up there, I can remember Sputnik going up. I built the radios into electronics, with radios in the 40s. But I built a little radio so I could tune into Sputnik, which flew overhead and went beep, beep, beep. And I think they just had somebody's pager on it or something. It didn't give a message, but the fact that it was flying around the Earth was just mind-boggling. And the whole rocket era, developed in the 40s and 50s. Those made a great difference. The computer, which was in its infancy, I guess, in the 50s, and I was always interested in electronics, so computers were of interest, and that's probably made the biggest change in, the general part of life and everything that happens. Computers, I think, were probably the biggest factor, but also medicine's changed dramatically, even though it was around, long before that. When my dad died, the doctor just put on angina, killed him, which was actually medically rather incorrect. Angina's the pain, but it was a heart problem and was never even diagnosed. He just died, in an hour, and that's a wonderful way to go. I hope all you looking can say the same about me, that I didn't have to go to a nursing home.
What kinds of books do you like to read?
I guess I like primarily nonfiction, although I can enjoy fiction. I don't read much fiction.
Let me change that to what kind of books did you like to read, referring back to your childhood?
Oh, when I was a kid, I liked to read all kinds of books. It didn't matter what it was. When we had summer vacation, it wasn't like today. You didn't go anywhere. There was no place to go. So, we were on a suburban street, but as I said, there were woods behind us, so it was not a great population in the area where we were. And I had buddies, and we did things together. But a lot of the summer vacations, especially my early teens, were spent in a hammock reading a book. And I would go down to the public library, and I used to take out all kinds of books. I can remember one was called the Chosin Europe, I think I called it. It was actually the word chaos, but I didn't know how to pronounce it. I have no idea what it was about, but I read it through, and I read lots of other books. I enjoyed, storybooks, but I think I also enjoyed exploring scientific things, and a lot of that still is with me. I like science, I like philosophy, and I guess a whole series of subjects. I like spirituality now, while I was vaguely interested in my teenage years, this has been a product of middle and late age, really. So I read a lot of those books today, and I read a rather broad variety, I think, of books. I mean, I read Catholic authors and Protestant authors and lots of other spiritual people to the left, to right, and some in the middle. And the newspaper, by the way, the New York Times.
It's my favorite. What were your favorite toys as a child, and why? What were they like?
Well, the earliest one, my family structure was my mom and dad and my grandmother, who was my mother's mother, and she lived with us. She had been a widow at an early age, came over from England. I don't know if you want all this history at this point, but she came over. Her husband came over first, Jim Pycock, and he came with his brother Ernest. They went to Canada, I guess because they were Brits. They could go there, and then when they got enough money together, they were Masons. They sent for their wives who came over, and my grandmother had then 3 or 4 children. I'm not sure when the last one was born here or born in England. But my mother was about 5 or 6 at the time. And so my grandfather died at an early age in his 30s somewhere. Both my grandfathers died in their 30s. Not uncommon. So she was left with 4 kids and no job and literally no money. And I'm not really sure how she survived, but she was a very generous, wonderful woman, very short, probably 5 feet. And I guess with family and friends and other things, she got along. But when my parents were married, she came to live with us, or before we were even born, I guess. So she was very distinctly part of the family structure. Now I've forgotten what the question was.
Your favorite toys.
Oh, I'm leading up to it. Now I know where I am. One of my earliest toys was my grandmother thought I should have a doll. So she got a doll. I was probably 4, I would assume. And more of this is from my parents than from my actual remembrance. And my grandmother made clothes for it. She loved to sew, and she made clothes. And this was a boy doll. This wasn't any fancy girl doll. And apparently I loved the doll and thought it was just wonderful. And so the earliest toy was a boy doll. I don't remember too many specific toys that we had. I probably had trucks. I don't recall that. Because it wasn't the age of plastics, which is probably one of the great changes in life. Trucks were either wood or metal, and they were pretty expensive, and we weren't totally broken anyway, but I don't remember any toys like that. Later, though, as I grew up and got into junior high school, I had chemistry sets and cameras, and I built my own enlarger, and I built a welding machine on my own, running at 110 volts right out of the wall. I remember I had a chemistry set. My dad had business people, customers. He took out to lunch, or supper actually was, my mother. So this couple who was, I think he was with U.S. Steel and who was a good customer. So my dad took him out to dinner, and then they came back to the house for, I don't know, cookies or coffee. In the meantime, I had been down in the basement, and I think it's hydrogen sulfide, as I recall, but it's the ingredients of a stink bomb. And the whole house reeked of this horrible smell, which was very exciting for my parents when they walked in. So that's some of the toys I had. And a bike and, those kind of things.
Who was the oldest person you can remember in your family as a child?
Well, the oldest was my 2 grandmothers. They had to be born somewhere around 1865 or 1875. I don't recall exactly, but they definitely were the oldest people that I knew. There might have been some people in the church. In fact, there probably were some elderly people in church, but I only knew them casually. In fact, there was one elderly woman when my grandmother was 91 or so. She said, "Oh, poor Mrs. Myrup," or whatever her name was. And my mother said, "What do you mean, poor old Mrs. Myrup?" Which is what my grandma said. Poor old Mrs. Myrup. She's only 86. So there were some old people around.
What were your schools like?
I only have vague recollections of school. I remember going. There were classes. There were always teachers there. They seemed ancient to me, but they were probably in their 30s. And I would say I enjoyed school. It was a social thing. There wasn't what I would call competition or bullies. We got into fights occasionally, but they were over very minor issues. And I always thought school was pretty much fun, you know. As I got older, I probably would have liked to do other things, but it never even crossed my mind.
Do you remember what your favorite subject was?
Probably science. I like science. I did well in history too, although I wasn't keen on it. And strangely enough, from high school, at any rate, in the earlier years of high school, a lot of Spanish is still in my brain. I was very poor at languages, and Spanish was one of them, but and it was the only one. But now I walk into McDonald's, and there's a Puerto Rican guy, or a Cuban guy, or a Mexican guy, or South American guy, and he asked what you want, and I said, you know, coffee. So he says, do you want cream or sugar? No, cafe negro. And it just comes to me. I don't know where it was. It just comes out. And the change, when he puts it out, it's 1.23 centavos. Now I can do that automatically, and yet I've never really used Spanish, nor have I studied it. I guess it took 1 year in college. I'm not sure whether I did or not as a requirement, but I did very poorly at Spanish, or any language, even the English language.
Now, back in your school period, did you and your friends have a special hangout?
No, we built spots in the woods because we had all this woods in back, and we loved to run through the woods, and we'd throw stones, and for a while, at one point, my dad bought me a .22 rifle, which in those days was a great adventure for a small boy. And I have it upstairs. He was out of his mind, I'm sure, because it was a Winchester, and I guess he saw it as a wonderful thing. And he knew I liked guns, and he was kind of interested in guns, although he wasn't really a hunter. And he bought me this. I think I was probably 12, but I'm not sure. And it was a pump gun. So it held 22 bullets in the long tube underneath the barrel. And every time you pumped the new shell in, it cocked the hammer so that all you had to do was pull the trigger, pump, pull, pump, 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 bam, 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 bam. You could get 10 shots off in about 10 seconds. Not a very healthy thing. When we ran through the woods and we shot at, you know, things in the trees and squirrel on the ground, a bottle we threw in a lake, and we'd try and shoot it out of the lake. And now that I think of it, it was probably a safety hazard.
Name a good friend that you have known for the longest period of time.
Now that's a hard one. I had friends in high school, but we never stuck together. I guess the only person I can even name would be Marjorie Whitman. But we did have, and well, I guess in thinking about that, the school friends are still, we had a 50th reunion. I hadn't seen, well, I virtually hadn't seen any of them for 45 years, and those, most of them I hadn't seen for 50 years, since we left high school. I went away to college. Marge and I got married early, and we moved to Hillsdale, and I just really saw almost nobody. But we had, in the youth group at church, it was a very close-knit group. It was a whole social group. It was a church in Hackensack, which was a long way away. But our whole social life was built there, and so I would say there's at least 10 people from a group of 30 that we are still very close with, and see anywhere from once a year to 10 times a year, even today. And we did a lot of intermarrying, that is, kids within the group married, so that we know husbands and wives for that length of time. The Milicheskis, just a whole bunch of people, Perrys, Austins.
Do you remember your family discussing world events and politics?
only in a vague sort of way. I mean, those were turbulent times, and I'm sure they spoke about the war. My dad was probably more interested in that, and he probably spoke quite a bit about it, but at my age, I don't think I was all that interested. I know he spoke about Hitler and the Germans, and in a derogatory way. Um, I'm trying to think of what other, FDR, he was pretty much a Republican, but not staunchly in the sense of just being a fanatic. And but I don't think FDR was a favorite of his. But there weren't strong political things, and I don't remember, no. Politics was not a big issue.
Do you have a college degree or secondary schooling?
No. Well, I went to college for 2 years at Wheaton, and then I came out. We were married. I went to work in New York. We were desperate to get married. We had wanted to get married at 18, which my father greatly discouraged. We were going to buy an old garage, and we could live above it, and I could repair bicycles. So fortunately, I didn't do that. Instead, I went to college for 2 years, and then I came back, and we were married, and I went to NYU for a year while I was working after work. And then there was a gap because now I had a child or two, I don't remember. And then I went to Fairleigh Dickinson in Teaneck for a couple of years. So I guess I put in all my hours, but they didn't amount to a degree, and it was one of the drawbacks. I don't feel bad about it, but my parents were both immigrant people, you know. To a great extent, my father was born here in Brooklyn, but he came from 2 Swedish-speaking people, and their great objective, both my parents only went to the 8th grade, then they went to work. And in those days, the teens and the early 20s, a job was everything. And so they only saw the great value of having a job and having an education. As long as you could read or write, who needs, why waste all those years and that money, which nobody had? My grandfather made $5 a week, so college wasn't even thought of and wasn't seen as a necessity. And I don't fault them for that because they were successes in their own time, but they weren't geared for the next generation. So they really didn't encourage education in any great way. In fact, I was the only one who went to college in my family, and all my uncles never went to college, and my father's brothers and sisters wasn't even thought of. And in fact, my dad later in life said, we made a big mistake with Arthur, who was the youngest, considerably younger. And all the other boys, there were 5 boys, were working. And they said we could have sent Arthur to college. And he was a dynamic guy, a very effective guy, became the president of the company. And I knew him very personally. And after my dad died in '55, I was 25, he was a surrogate father to me. In a very healthy way, he was removed. He let me do my own thing. He didn't tell me what to do. But if I asked any questions, he had a lot of good wisdom. And, he was a very capable guy, but he never went to college. So it just wasn't seen as a high priority.
How old were you when you first started dating?
13. Well, I can hardly call it dating. I went out with Marge when I was 13 to a roller skating party the church put on or something. And we went to the youth group every Sunday night, which was the biggest social event of the week because there were 20 or 30 other kids our age, and promoted by all the church ladies and a couple of the couples. So if that qualifies for dating, I guess that's when it began. Probably turned more serious at 15 or 16.
Do you remember your first kiss?
No, I don't. I was probably 14. I don't know.